Welcome to another Early Years Learning Hub podcast. My name is Jackie Ward and I'm the founder and managing director of the Early Years Learning Hub. This is one of our Unpacking Theory and Research series where I invite academics, researchers and experts to tell us what the theory, research or contemporary understandings mean for our day-to-day practice and our work as teachers, educators and leaders. This episode is about the ideology and theory behind inclusive practice and why it's so important that we embrace inclusion. And today I'm joined by Sarah Corlon, who is Head of Research and Special Education at STAR. Sarah, would you like to tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and your professional journey?
Sure. Well, I'm an early childhood teacher by background, so I've been involved in the early years for over 20 years now. So going back originally when I was first going through uni, my early childhood teaching degree, I worked in an infants and toddlers room, absolutely loved it. So I've got a real passion for those very, very early years. I worked with some children with a disability or delay within those services, and I really wanted to learn more about how I could really support them and their families. So I went back and did a Master of Special Education at uni, and at that time I did a lot of casual work through an agency, so it was great because I saw a whole range of different types of services in that role. So in the casual early childhood teaching, I worked, in really large services, tiny services, preschools, long daycare services, and from sort of not-for-profit, for-profit, and saw the whole range. And it really comes down to, I think, the individuals within each of those services rather than a particular type or style being the gold standard. I think in early years we're all here for a reason. I don't think anyone's here in early years teaching for the money. We're all here because we're passionate about working with children and families. So I actually went back and did my PhD as well, and I focused on how parents of young children with autism decided what sort of interventions or early childhood intervention to choose with their young children, because there was so much at that time. There was a real push for sort of this diagnosis of autism. There was lots of money going particularly to intervention for autism at the time, and lots of funny practices popping up that didn't necessarily have research behind them. And I thought, how on earth do families work out what to do when you're sort of given this diagnosis and this huge range of things you might try with your child? How do they work out what's more likely to work, what has evidence? And really at the end of the day, one of the main things that came out of that was the relationship that parents had with professionals that they trusted. And you can see there where early childhood educators can be a really important key in that, but also sort of being aware of what's out there became important. So I then moved into more of an early childhood intervention sort of role after that, but working with early childhood services. So at STAR, Special Teaching and Research, we partner with early years services because we understand that we can't come in as experts and sort of work with a child or family one-on-one, or even with educators, sort of come into an educational service and do anything special and magic that can't be done throughout the day and week. So children need practice in everyday environments. And so I've done a lot of work supporting early years educators to sort of assess children to work out where they're at within their service, where they might need a little bit of extra support, and writing that into an individual learning plan that is doable within your normal program. And so that's sort of where I'm at the moment. Here at STAR, I did have a little while over at uni lecturing in special education as well, but I really like sort of being able to have that touch with practice and see how it happens in practice. So really passionate about getting the research out there into the real world.
Well, that sounds amazing. I'm always fascinated to hear everyone's professional journey and what's the pathway and what are all the building blocks to help that person be, the confident and capable person that they are. I'm interested in a few things there because I've recently come back into the teaching space,
Yeah.
and really, like, I think that we all as teachers in the early childhood space and throughout the school space, I think we're all committed to the value of inclusion and making sure we're supporting children with additional needs, but the reality of doing that is tricky.
Yes.
And I've really, I've supporting a child in my preschool with autism this year. And just the things that you just mentioned there about having someone come in with that sort of expert knowledge and real understanding of how theory translates to practice has been really amazing. We had a chat with this child's occupational therapist, which I had to ask her, what exactly does an occupational therapist do? And she was really great in, supporting myself and the other teacher to understand, some really small shifts in what we could do to really help the child settle in better and to feel more relaxed and comfortable. So I think the first thing I wanted to talk about is that sort of overarching sort of requirement of inclusion. It's one of the guiding principles of the NQF. There's also a Disability Discrimination Act that we're required to comply with. So can you talk us through a little bit about why inclusion is so important and all of those sort of overarching requirements?
Yeah, sure can. I think when you ask me about inclusion, I think that you and I have a very similar sort of viewpoint and understanding of what we mean when we say inclusion, but people may not necessarily know, does that mean that we need to enrol these children in our services? What does that mean if we've sort of enrolled them and they're in the room? Does that mean they're included? So a few years ago, back in 2016, Early Childhood Australia released a statement on the inclusion of, and it was a broader statement, not just for children with disability, but for children from a whole range of groups. But what does inclusion actually mean? The definition that they've got in there is one that we use all the time here at STAR when we're talking about inclusion, and that's that the child has access to, is supported to participate meaningfully in, and therefore has positive outcomes from early childhood education and care. And I think that's really key to sort of stem. I think, okay, so what we're talking about, if they have access with, they can't learn at all. Children can't learn at all if they're not in our early years environments, but we actually do also have to support them to participate meaningfully, and that's when we see the positive outcomes for them and their families. So it's really useful because it sort of demonstrates that there's those three components to inclusion. And as you said before, Jackie, equity, inclusion and diversity really underpin our national quality framework. And I think if we think back to the latest revisions of our curriculum documents, the Early Years Learning Framework and My Time, Our Place, there was a real shift in the terminology and language that they used in there, where they actually pointed out, like, we're actually saying under the Disability Discrimination Act, you need to make reasonable adjustments. That was always the case since the Act was in place from 1992, but I think we didn't necessarily, I think that's part of why early childhood educators found it so hard and overwhelming, because we thought this disability is a whole other thing. We've got our normal practice, and then we've got to do special things for children that might have disability or a delay, or we need to work, but it's actually embedded within our regular practice. So I think that should be sort of help people to maybe feel a little bit more relaxed around that, okay, so that just means we might need to make some little changes. We don't have to treat every child the same, and that's what we do anyway.
Yeah, that's right. It's a very individualised approach, isn't
Yeah.
it? And I would agree. I love the fact that the Disability Discrimination Act is mentioned in there, because it really made me think a lot about, one of the things is, the term full participation and reasonable adjustments, because I think it really says, like, it's not just about a child sitting on the edge of a group time, let's just say, participating. They're not really participating, but there's a great, we have a course supporting children with a disability and or additional needs, and there's a great video where a teacher talks about how she sort of accommodates to incorporate a child who has Down syndrome and what.
Yeah.
So they've shifted their routine a little bit, and they've done all of these different little things, and she
Mm.
includes different. I forget what it is, a communication aid or something else in the group times to allow that child to participate in a way that's, appropriate for his developmental needs and all of that kind of stuff. So I think for me, that sort of really made me think about the idea of how we're supporting this child to, benefit from all the rich opportunities that we have in our program. But I think I just wanted to jump back to Sarah because what you talked about before, I think, a lot of services feel that they need to include children, but then they don't also, they're floundering because they're not doing all the supports to support themselves as well.
Yeah.
So accessing inclusion support, accessing the professionals that work with that child to help them develop a plan of action and develop, strategies and things that they can use. So I think, one of the things that I don't want to put pressure on people to think, oh, yes, we do have to include people without saying, okay, but you
Yeah.
also are entitled
Yeah.
to a lot of support to do that.
Yeah. And actually, Early Childhood Australia and Early Childhood Intervention Australia, around the same time, actually put out a joint statement specifically on inclusion of children with a disability or delay. And in there, they actually stated that our early years educators and teachers need to be supported to do this. We don't expect them to be able to do this on their own. So I think that's important, and maybe just understanding the Disability Discrimination Act and what that means in terms of an early years context or outside of school care context is the first step. And again, ASEQA a couple of years ago put up some great resources on their website there.
They're
And,
amazing, those
and
resources, aren't they? Yeah.
yeah, and to be able to share with the community within your service as well, so they actually understand why it's important that you're doing this work and what it means. So there's posters that you can put up so that parents and families coming in can sort of understand. Oh, this is really important that this is going on within.
And I think that idea too that a message that I really love is that operating in an inclusive way makes it definitely accessible for people with a disability, but it makes it easier for everyone to be a
Oh,
part of that
that's
place.
exactly what I was thinking when you were telling
Yeah,
the story about those adjustments for that child. And I haven't seen the little clip, but I can guarantee when I was sort of picturing what might be in there, that there would be multiple children within that group that would have benefited
yeah.
from those little adjustments to, the structure of the group time, or making it more hands-on and, inclusive. There's the different visual supports. There's always other children within the group that actually benefit from the sorts of adjustments that you might put in for a child with a disability or delay. So it's really a win-win.
Well, and I
For
think about
everyone.
it too, like my children, grew up with some children with disabilities in their regular classrooms and whatnot. And I think it really, really supported them to understand the diversity and, operate with care, empathy, and respect. They were always, you know, talking to me about how that they had had chats with the kids in high school in the life skills courses and things like that. And I just thought it's really breeding that acceptance of diversity and, that, as I said, caring for others. And, I think there's lots of nice things around inclusion. So I'm interested to have a bit of a controversial chat next about this whole theory around inclusion, and whether or not. So there's two schools of thought. I know I used to work with a colleague who was very strong in one rather than the other, but I think that for me, it's sort of probably a little bit more like different children experience benefit from a different approach, like everything. So the schools of thought are that some children do better in a mainstream service and some children do better in a specialised service to lead to better outcomes. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Um, well, it's, as we were sort of chatting a little bit before we started recording, that it's not a black and white situation. So I think there's sort of two things here in terms of the human right to be included within within society and within have access to good quality learning opportunities throughout your life. So everybody has that. that human right. And then on the other hand, there's also sort of the research that says how children sort of learn within different contexts, within sort of different supports that are offered to them. And we really need to focus on that access to quality education and not necessarily an educational setting. So it might be if the child has access to, as we said before, even within an early childhood service, if just because the child is in the room, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily having access to good quality learning. It is so much easier. We are so privileged in early childhood education and care settings and in those outside of school hours care settings because we have such a flexible curriculum, that play-based curriculum where we can make adjustments, and it is that sort of developmental. We're used to working with children with a huge range of development across developmental areas anyway. So to include a child with a disability or developmental delay, even a child with quite high sort of physical support needs, it's a lot easier to do that within an early childhood service. And there's, as you said, Jackie, reaching out to the family, to all of the other supports around that child to say, hey, how can we do this well? What sort of little tips do you have to be able to help us the child to access the learning within our service? A little bit trickier sometimes when you get to the school and the school-based curriculum, and even thinking about, you know, how we can use smaller groups and all those sorts of things within early years or outside of school care settings. You may not necessarily be able to do that within a mainstream kindergarten classroom. So it's really the fact that the learning programs aren't really prescriptive within the early years gives us that that breadth to be able to make those adjustments. Sometimes as children move into the school, it becomes a little bit more complex, and it's really down to the decision of the family. So the family might decide that a particular setting, whether it's a specialised setting or the mainstream setting, is better for their child or their family at that point. One thing that's good to remember as if you're working in those prior to school settings is that families aren't locked into a particular choice once for entering school. So if they've decided we want to give our mainstream local kindergarten class a go to mainstream school, they're not locked into staying there forever, and vice versa. They might choose a specialised setting, and a lot of those sort of specialised settings will work towards, they reassess at the end of each year, is this the right place? They work with the family and have a look at where the child's at. Is this still the right setting for this child? Would you maybe choose another setting now? So sort of knowing the options, whether it's a sort of mainstream classroom, a specialised school, or a support class within a mainstream school, which is sort of a mix. It's important for us to sort of know what the possible options are, and also know that just because a child goes to a specialised school, that doesn't mean that that's all they're experiencing. We've had families that have gone through our program when we've worked with early childhood services. We work very closely with the families of the children in that transition to school, and what we find there is some of the families have said, this specialised school is the best place for my child. That doesn't mean that that's all the child or family is doing or experiencing in terms of that inclusion in the local community and social engagement with children, other children that don't have disabilities. They were going to their regular local dance classes. They were going to, football down at the park with other things. They were very, shopping in the local community. So it's not that they weren't exposed, or that other children and families within that community. Jackie, as you're saying, it's so important for us to have that understanding of difference when exposed. And then on the other side, we've had families that have chosen to go to a local mainstream school and gone through that inclusive education. But they found that it was important for their child and their family to experience sort of disability-specific social groups on the weekends, or go along to all ability sports teams where they actually have more contact with other children and people with lived experience of disability, because that was really important in terms of accessing that community. So I think we can't just assume that because if a child goes a particular way that they're, if they go to the local inclusive setting, that means therefore their life is inclusive, and if they go to a specialised setting, that their life is cut off and not inclusive in that way.
Yeah, very true. And it's kind of like, I think, like everything that we do, it'll be up to the individual,
Yeah.
as you say, not just the child, but also the family and what works. And, I think it's about being open to, finding the best solution for every child and family, isn't it? And I also think just what you were mentioning about the difference between early childhood and school age care and schools. I remember when I first started working in my former role at the Department of Education, I was with the school teams and they'd talk about differentiation. I'm like, what is this differentiation? I'm like, oh, we do that all the time, like we
Yes.
just always, we set up an individualized curriculum for every child based on the frameworks, the learning frameworks. So I definitely think it's something that early childhood teachers and educators do really well automatically, that idea of saying, okay, well, what can we tweak so that reasonable adjustments just naturally happen, because we're going, okay, well, we need to, we know that everyone, I always refer to age and stage development, because developmentally appropriate practice isn't necessarily always aligned with, chronological age, but there's definitely some stages that everyone has in common, whereas they might not all be at the same age doing those things. So it's about thinking about ways to provide enriching experiences for everyone. I know we've talked a little bit about reasonable adjustments or anything else, but is there anything else that you wanted to share on that topic, Sarah? Have we already covered it, or?
Yeah, I think we've probably covered most of it. I mean, I can give you the sort of official definition of a
Yeah.
of a reasonable adjustment, which is just sort of actions that are taken by educators or service leadership to make sure. So it's basically just, what do we do to support this child to have access to our learning program?
Yes, and
And
it
I
could
think
be it could be as big as a ramp, couldn't it? If
it
you
could,
if
yes,
you needed to, if you had stairs and you didn't have disability access, but usually it's more commonly much smaller things, isn't it?
it
Um,
is. And I think maybe the importance of documenting it. So one of the easiest ways to document all these reasonable adjustments that you're making is through an individual learning plan for that child within your service. So that's a really easy way where, if you're going through assessment and ratings, then you actually have records of, yes, we've met with this child's family, other support services that may support this child, such as occupational therapist or a speech pathologist, and these are the things we've put into place to support this child. It actually becomes that documented evidence as well as a real guide to how you can all make sure that you're using the same sort of strategies and techniques to support that child, and they're not getting sort of bombarded and overwhelmed by a whole heap of different input from different adults in their learning environment as well. So the individual learning plan sort of has a couple of different uses in a way, but that's one of the easiest ways to do it, is that, hey, we're documenting that. It's not that we have to go and make, again, it's making sure that sort of people understand that it can feel so overwhelming, but you just embed it into your daily practice, that individual learning plan is the planning document for that child's learning. It doesn't need to be on top of, you embed it into your regular programming.
I'm really glad you said that, Sarah. And I was definitely thinking about the child that I mentioned earlier. I
Yeah.
did up an individualized learning plan because we have one as a template in our course, and I was thinking it's a really good centralized spot for anything to talk about these. So great spot to record my notes from the discussion with the occupational therapist. Great spot to critically reflect on some of the things. For example, I did up a social story with pictures of the child and the preschool and all that kind of stuff, and got a chance to record on there how that supported her, and again, then actions for other actions, the OT recommended things like doing up a visual routine board, and again, critically reflecting on whether or not she wasn't really as interested in that. So there's an opportunity. I feel like it's a one-stop shop, isn't it? And I love how you've mentioned it's not on top of that. Is my assessment and planning for that child. It's all through there. I mean, it's not, I will probably move on to do some more individualized, other records, but to start with, that's sort of where I was recording all the information.
Yeah, and I think that again is how we can sort of get overwhelmed and think, oh, I have to have an individual plan, and then I've got to have my regular programming. And if you sort of go through, I'm sure in your course it's probably pretty similar, that you're going through the regular planning cycle to plan
Yeah.
for a child,
Yep.
for an individual learning plan for a child as well. So
Yeah.
yeah,
And I definitely want to stress that, you know, that moves us nicely onto our next one, which I always like to think about, the idea of thinking of the child first,
yeah,
disability second, because I think sometimes we get, in our commitment and our enthusiasm to be really inclusive and make sure that we are, supporting full participation. It's always thinking about the disability first. And I think if we want a child to really be experiencing rich and meaningful learning experiences, we need to be thinking about the way we would program and plan for them like any other child.
yes. And I think that's important as well because of the huge range of, just because a child has a particular disability label. For example, I mean, we've spoken a lot about autism today, but you might have one child with an autism diagnosis that presents very, very differently to another child with an autism diagnosis. So that diagnosis in itself is not going to give you too much to go on in terms of how do I program or plan for this child. And what early years teachers and educators are really expert at is how children learn in play-based settings, how they learn within your learning environment, or your kindergarten or year one classroom. You are experts on how children learn in that setting. So you really need to look at that child in the setting, because there might be sort of behaviours or things that you actually don't see at all, that when the child goes to one-on-one therapy in the occupational with an occupational therapist, or that's happening at home, that you don't actually see. But what you see here is, they're really interested in this. I can see they're on the periphery of a little group of children that they might need a little bit of support to just sort of break in. You see that they're there. So I think, the first thing you do, and we actually talk about a non-categorical approach to working with young children, which just means it doesn't matter which disability or delay category they may or may not fit into. And a lot of the children that we're working with may not have a diagnosis or a label, and that's fine, because you just need to look at where the child is at and how you can support them to learn like you would for any other child.
It's really how the assessment and planning cycle starts, isn't it?
Yes,
Gathering that information about what children know, can do, understand, what are their skill levels, where do we think that they'd like to go next, involving families in setting goals. It's
yeah,
exactly the same, isn't
yeah,
it?
yeah.
Um,
So I think that's good, because I think sometimes we think, oh, is there something, should I be doing more? Is it more complex? But I mean, that gathering of information, if you do have a child with diagnostic reports or reports from specialists, like a speech pathologist and occupational therapist, there might be some things within those reports, sort of recommendations around, if it's a physio, how to particularly, support a child to sit or move in a particular way, or how to, support a child. Um, but there's a lot of information in those reports that may not be useful to you. So I think, yes, if you've got access to that report, that is all, information in that first phase of the assessment and planning cycle. Be aware of it, but sort of always being aware of, okay, what does that mean for the child in my learning service? And if you're not sure, then you need to go back to the either the family or the professional that sort of provided that report and say, but explain that to me in terms of what does that mean for the child to be able to,
yeah, that's a
go
really
through
good
time or
point.
play with this. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think too, like my recent experience with settling in a child in that way is, and the family was saying it to me a lot too, you know, I reached out to the family last year and had a chat prior to enrolment, and that was really helpful. I think that was a really great start to building those relationships with families, but also being sort of comfortable in that empty space of not knowing, you know, like this particular child had issues with loud noises and storms and things at home, but she seems fine at the preschool and doesn't, you know, our hand dryers are really loud, and she was, you know, straight away using them and happy about it. So,
Yeah.
you know, it's, I guess it's just going with the flow and seeing, you know, and being really observant. That's the other thing I would definitely
Yeah.
say, you know, like, because she's really quiet about, you know, her responses to some things sometimes. And I had this incident where she'd drawn this amazing picture, and I'd asked her, would she like me to write, you know, information about what she told me, this is daddy and this is whatever, on there, and she said yes. And then I said, do you think I'd be able to keep this picture, you know, because I wanted to keep it for her
Yeah.
records. And then she said yes at the time, and I sort of just put it over there to the side. And then I thought she was making noises, you know, I was sitting right next to her, I thought she was making noises about when she was drawing, you know, sometimes kids do it. And I kind of looked over there and she was crying, and I was like,
Oh,
oh, what's wrong? And she sort of pointed to her picture, and I said, oh, do you not want Mrs. Ward to keep it? And she was like, no. And I was like, oh, well, maybe I can just take a picture. Is that okay? So I took a picture of it. But, you know, that idea of being more observant and more vigilant
yeah.
than you might need to be, say, for your typically developing child, because you know, a 4-year-old might have just said that to me, mightn't they? Oh, you know, but she had that issue where communication is a bit more of a challenge. So that's kind of some of those reasonable adjustments, and you know, where the disability comes in. Yes, you know,
Yeah.
treating her child first. But anyhow, the next thing I wanted to talk about is working with families, because I know that's a real area of expertise for you. So what can we provide to support families to, you know, feel, I guess, you know, that connection with the service? Because it's very overwhelming, isn't it, when you first started a new service for everyone. But I think families with a child with a disability have an extra burden, or feel an extra weight, I guess,
Yeah.
as they start.
Yeah, so I think what we were talking about a little bit earlier when we were talking about those Disability Discrimination Act resources, we're having the fact that you are inclusive, and a lot of services do this through their philosophy or in their service handbook, just putting out the fact that you are an inclusive service and why that's important for all families, so they don't feel like that's sort of number one. Again, we're really lucky as early years professionals, because that supporting families is so important for a child with a disability or delay. But that's what we are regularly doing for all families anyway. So I think if you continue doing the things that you're doing for all families anyway, making sure that you're aware of the other support services in your local areas. I think early years services are getting really good at connecting with local schools, which is a big one. But being aware, perhaps sometimes if you haven't had a child with a disability come through your service yet, or with a sort of significant disability where they might need to access a specialised school service, actually being aware of the different processes for school enrolment, especially through the local government Department of Ed schools. So that all families do need to go to the school that they're zoned in to enrol in school, and even if they're hoping to access a different school that might be a specialised setting or a different school outside of that catchment area, just sort of knowing to be able to give the families the information that, okay, your first stop is going to school. And again, on the Department of Ed website, they've got some really good sort of checklists on there now. They keep updating, but being aware of the other resources that are there. Again, I think in terms of supporting families, it's about respecting where that family is at. And this is particularly for a child that you might have suspicions around a delay or potentially a disability. I think and sometimes I think, Jackie, it comes from a good place in terms of us thinking, I'm not quite sure how I can best support this child. I want to support inclusion. I want to be able to access inclusion support funding. I want to be able to do all of these things. Let me see if the parent can go and get a disability diagnosis or some kind of external assessment for their child. Sometimes really pushing that can put families off. And we've got to remember that we're not developmental psychologists and we can't actually diagnose children as well. We definitely can share information about where children are at and share that with the family, but doing that in a really sensitive way is really key.
I couldn't agree more, Sarah. I often talk about the idea of staying in your lane. And I
Yes.
think as a teacher, you do have a really specialised knowledge about typical development and ages and stages and, learning trajectories and all those sorts of things. But you're not someone who can diagnose a disability, and you shouldn't be preempting anything. A conversation could happen around I've noticed this, what do you notice at home? And a slowly approach.
Keeping
You're
it
raising
open.
something that is potentially life changing for a parent to say that, we think that there might be something that's not quite, within typical development for your child. That's a massive thing to have to absorb as a parent, isn't it? Even if it doesn't pan out that way. But yeah, basically that kind of labeling that there's something wrong with your child
Yes.
and we want to be able to fix it is a bit
Yeah.
of an issue in itself, I think.
Yeah.
I think, outcomes focus first is a great way to have conversations with families, isn't it? We just want the best for your child and that we're on the same team.
Yes, and I think telling them what you will do or what you are doing, the strategies you are trying in terms of supporting the child in that particular area of development that you might be concerned about, or areas of development, because we've had families where I know it sounds silly. A family came away from a conversation with their early service, and they actually pulled the child and put them in a different service, where the takeaway they got from that was that you need to get a disability diagnosis. You have to go and get an assessment and get a diagnosis because that means we can get funding and we can get more. And then she was like, they want to make money off my child. And we all know that that
Yeah.
inclusion support program, but it doesn't even cover the full amount that the service will be paying for the extra person in the room to support all children because they have that. But that's just not the message that this family got. And we've had other instances where, you know, around, and it may not even necessarily be related to a disability or delay, but there might be some behaviours of concern or behaviours that are really challenging within the environment, and that sort of letting the family know, your child did X, Y, Z today, but nothing about, and these are the strategies we're going to use, or this is what we're, talking to her about to try and support it. So often these things sort of get, and I think it's because we want to feel that we're sharing with the family and having those conversations, but being aware of how families might take this. And as you said, it has to be that slowly, gently, but I think also including, this is what we're doing, this is what we'll keep telling you about in terms of strategies, and what works well at home. Are you seeing this at home? And if the family says they're not seeing it at home, or that, we've had, no, the child is, the child talks in full sentences at home, doesn't, we can't assume that the family's not telling us the truth.
So another thing I guess that I'd love to chat to you about, Sarah, is working with NDIS plans and what does that look like? How can we manage requests from service providers, and how we sort of balance that with their right to fully participate in the program? Because I think this is a really unknown space, so I'd love to get your thoughts on this.
It is. The first thing, in terms of if you do have external providers that are wanting to come in and work in your early years classroom, or early school years classroom, or your early childhood education and care classroom, the main thing for you to sort of remember is that the focus of those external providers should actually be on supporting that child to participate in your learning program. So best practice in early childhood intervention states which is what we know from research, is that children learn best when they're supported to learn within their natural everyday routines and environments. So if we think of the early childhood education and care settings, they're really key natural environments for children to learn. And when we know that they learn within routines and with what's called distributed practice, which is lots of little practices. So rather than expect, and this again is not some, I think as early childhood educators and teachers would think, of course, you don't expect a child to be able to sit for an hour or half an hour block and learn within that. It should actually be distributed. So the role of those early childhood intervention providers should be to come and support you as one of the key people that have the most amount of time with the child, have the most opportunity to actually positively influence their development. When we think especially about, in the early years of school as well, apart from the child's family, you're the people that have the most time with the child to influence their development. So when someone comes into your service, it should really be to support you and for you to share, because you're the expert within that setting of how the child is. So as I said before, I think I said this earlier, they might present quite differently in a one-on-one therapy setting or at home, but you know what they are like within your service. You're sort of the expert of the child in your setting. You're the expert. You are experts in child development. I think it's easy for us as early childhood educators and teachers to sort of go, oh, allied health, they're like doctors, they're like medical people, they're experts in this area. They might have some specialised knowledge around particular things. And Jackie, you were describing earlier, an occupational therapist who came in and gave you some really sort of key, useful tips. But they should be able to explain how you can embed that into your regular program. So really having those conversations early with the provider and with the family to say, okay, we need to make an agreement around when's the best time for you to actually come to the service. It's important for the child to, if you're working on a particular skill, could you include one or two other children so that they're actually learning alongside their peers? Is it a time when you would actually have an educator to be able to sit down and learn from the allied health person as well, as opposed to them just sort of taking their child and making it, this separate one-on-one where they may as well be in a therapy room if they're not going to sort of do it in an inclusive way within your setting. So it's a lot of negotiation, and then the actual NDIS plans in themselves will become one of those key little pieces of documentation when we're thinking about making an individual learning plan. That, okay, so what are some of the strategies in there, or even what are the main goals? And that you might use that when you're talking to family. Okay, so in your NDIS plan, I can see that communication is a really key goal. What's one little thing we can work on in terms of communication? So those individual learning plans are good in terms of choosing sort of between 3 to 5 key sort of little objectives that you can work towards, rather than thinking, oh, there's so much we could do to support this child. What are all the different areas we can support? So you all agree as a team, and you might have the NDIS providers actually in on that meeting alongside the family to think about. They might suggest particular strategy, and you'll say, oh yeah, we could do that during this time. We can easily embed those visual supports during group time. That might help the other children. But if it was something really weird that you wouldn't normally do within your setting, you're well within your rights to say, look, that's not going to work for us. We're not going to be able to do that for that child.
I love that message, Sarah, that we want to make sure that, all the educators, teachers and leaders feel confident to, A, be an advocate for the best interests of the child, but B, also to take the lead and, recognise their own expertise and professionalism and, take charge, I guess, because I would wholeheartedly agree. I think, people can often think, oh, they're a professional and they, their time is precious or whatever else, but really it's about making, the best possible outcomes for children, and you do that by saying, well, what fits in best with your service too, doesn't it? So you don't have to be an open door available 24/7 if it's not going to achieve the best outcome for the child. So That's amazing. That has been a really awesome chat, Sarah. I'm sure we could go on and on and on, but
Oh, we could talk all day.
I really appreciate your time. And we'll make sure that we include links to. We mentioned quite a few things in this
Yeah.
episode, so I'll make sure they're in the podcast notes. Also, if anyone's interested, the Early Years Learning Hub has a course that is great value. It's a 3-module course all about supporting children with a disability and or an additional need. We have an individualised learning plan template, lots of videos and lots of resources that people might find helpful. And thank you for listening to another episode of the Early Years Learning Hub podcast in the Unpacking Theory and Research series. Thank you so much, Sarah, for joining us. And yeah, hope listeners enjoyed.
Thanks, Jackie.